idea that Blacks were slaves, as if they had no other identity, as opposed to kings and queens in Africa who had advanced knowledge, or that even that there were civilizations before our civilization that was far more advanced than what we are right now. Yeah. And we think that we're like at the pinnacle of evolution right now, and we've got the sickest people living on the planet. We've got the highest suicide rates. We have most people medicating just to be alive on the planet right now, either for emotional issues or physical issues. And we think that this is advanced civilization, and that the people running the show, like as if the highest office in North America is like the person who's the leader of the planet, basically. And like that's supposed to be representative of like mass like enlightenment and technological advance or something. And it's
Hi everyone, I am Nicolette Richet and I am your host of the Eat Real to Heal podcast. Now, as you can see from the background, I'm actually in my 78 VW van, pulled over on the side of the road in Campbell River, BC, where I came for a week with my girls so that they can attend an equestrian horse riding camp, so they can learn all about taking care of horses and how to ride them in a kind and humane and wonderful way, how to connect with them. And I did that because my kids have been home with me since March 15th, since COVID struck and we had to close down our businesses. And I'm starting to realize that, 3.5, 4 months in, it's really getting challenging to figure out how to balance out my work hours with my kids being at home, making sure that they're happy, but then also making sure that I'm able to fulfill my role in running the Green Mustache companies and the Richer Health companies and the Wellness Center. And I have to admit, it has not been easy. It's been joyous, I have to say. I love being home and on my property in Pemberton. It's a gorgeous space. And normally I'm on the road and traveling for work or traveling just to get to the office. And it really has been pretty challenging. But to be home has been fantastic. It's the longest amount of time that I've ever spent on my property. And in several years, it's the longest amount of time that I've been able to just have, endless days with my kids. Now, of course, there's been lots of fighting. There's been lots of love. There's been lots of flow. There's been lots of chaos. It's been literally everything all rolled into this COVID pandemic experience. But we're just taking it one day at a time, 1 week at a time. And so I actually brought my kids to Campbell River because we found this great outdoor, amazing horse camp where the kids could be outdoors and where the groups are really tiny, but we feel that, we're not spreading, contributing to the spread of the COVID virus. We're still, self-isolating as much as we can to make sure that the spread doesn't continue. Now, in being here on this side of the road, I realized that I actually love consistency and I am a perfectionist. And so it was really hard for me to record this intro that I'm about to record for this amazing podcast that I finally got to do with Sarinda Hoilett. She is a beautiful human in the Sea to Sky corridor. I'm going to tell you all about her. But normally I'm all set up in my podcast studio with my microphone and with my background that is, beautiful. And, I tried to set that up in our Airbnb where we were staying, and that didn't work because it was really too noisy. I tried to set it up in a hotel room that I booked for the night, but that turned out to not work out as well. And then I just was like, well, we'll just postpone the podcast until I realized that I am a perfectionist. And when all things are not perfect, it's really hard for me to move forward. So I like that this brought this up for me this week, but it's also been really hard because it's holding me back from doing a lot of really important things that I want to do that will allow me to fulfill the dreams and the desires that I have for my business. So I don't know about you listeners out there. I am sure that many of you are perfectionists, But I have decided, after sitting here in my van thinking, am I going to record here in the van or, wait till I get back home next week to record, which would mean delaying this awesome show for you for another week. And I just decided to go for it. But a lot of people think that just because I run a business, several businesses, and that I have several employees, that I'm just a get her done type of person. And that is furthest from the truth. I am a human who is afflicted by all of the self-sabotaging tricks that our subconscious mind holds over us. And in this case, it really got the better of me. And then I realized, what is holding me back? I love my van. I'm in a 78 Volkswagen van. This is going to be the van that is going to be my support vehicle for running and biking across Canada, 7,000 kilometers, starting on June 1st next year. We are going to convert this van into an electric vehicle, and then we're going to raffle the van off to some amazing soul. We're going to pick their ticket, and they're going to get a fully converted electric 78 classic VW van. And this van is our happy place. And so why wouldn't I want to bring this podcast to you out of this van? I don't know. So if you're a perfectionist out there, here's my advice. Figure out what's holding you back from accomplishing your goals, your mini tasks, your big tasks, whatever it is that you have set out in front of you, ahead of you. What is stopping you from accomplishing it? Yes, mine is perfectionism. It might be for you. It might be fear of failure. It might be fear of disappointing others. It could be guilt. It could be shame. It could be, there's a million reasons why. But the minute you tap into it, and you actually hold that in front of you. And that's exactly what I did in my van. It was like I put it in my hand and I said, what is holding me back from recording this podcast, this intro to the podcast? The podcast was already done in my studio. This is just the intro. And when the word perfectionism really, screamed out loudly, and I saw it sitting there in the palm in front of my hand, I just made me laugh. It made me realize how silly it is. So just even voicing it, acknowledging it, understanding that it's just a thing. Really, it's just a thing. It's not even really a tangible thing, even though I'm holding it in my hand like it is. And once you just look at it and regard it, it's amazing how you can make decisions to then overcome it. So either go over it, around it, through it, bust it up, whatever it is. And I realized, journalists are out there all the time bringing us news from the field, from the front lines. And it doesn't, things don't have to be perfect. The sound doesn't have to be perfect. What's more important is bringing the story to people. And Sarinda's story is so important because it's all about Black Lives Matter. It's all about sustainability. It's about taking care of each other as humans, as citizens of the planet. It's about taking care of the planet and so much more. So let's dive into, so who is Sarinda? So normally I'd have, my notes up here on the screen, but I don't today. So I'm just going to read it from my iPhone, her bio, because I want to make sure I really nail this, because Sarinda is such a beautiful human being that I'm so excited that you all get to know. So Sarinda is an integrative wellness practitioner. Her practice focuses on supporting individuals in a balanced and sustainable approach to health and wellness. She specializes in healing modalities rooted in Ayurveda, plant-based nutrition, Herbology, and Somatic Body Therapies. Probably something I need right now to move me through this idea of things needing to be perfect. Because actually it's just better done instead of perfect. Sarinda has worked as a massage practitioner for over 25 years, as a yoga instructor and a plant-based chef as well. I have been able to sample Sarinda's food like over the years, endless times, and her food is spectacular. It is so delicious. And she's an incredible instructor as well. And she's currently working as a wellness coach and completing her doula training. And you can connect with her on Instagram at Sarinda H, or through her website at sarindahoilett.com, which is a beautiful website. And her business is called Wild Planet Raw Food. So let's welcome Sarinda to the Eat Real to Heal podcast, and let's dive into this incredible show. So important what you're about to hear. And you know what to do. If you love this show, please share it with others and invite them into the Eat Real to Heal world, where they can learn all about how to use food as medicine to reverse their chronic diseases, but also how to incorporate and create a whole entire holistic wellness approach to your life, because we need balance in all areas of our life as well. So we talk about food predominantly, but we also talk about sleep. We also talk about sex. We also talk about all different kinds of nutrition. We talk about wellness, about exercise, movement, so many different things, because once we have all of that in balance, then that is when we get to experience true optimal health. So welcome, Sarinda, to the show. Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. I'm your host, Nicolette Richet. And on today's show, we have Sarinda Hoilett, all the way from beautiful Pemberton, British Columbia. Thank you, Sarinda, for being on our show today.
Thank you. I'm stoked to be here.
Super excited about also what brought you onto the show, which really started off with us bumping into each other at the farmers market last week in Pemberton. And we just got into an incredible conversation. I was so inspired by our talk afterwards. And I was like, finally, I have found the woman that needs to be on our show so we can really dive into so many beautiful topics, but one particularly that is at the heart of society right now, which is Black Lives Matter. But I don't want to get into that right now, because we are going to touch on that. We are going to touch on the interconnectivity of nutrition and health and COVID and wellness and pain and discomfort. And of course, Black Lives Matter. But you were one of the few people in our community that I felt could really enrich this conversation. So I'm excited to dive into that with you. So Sarinda, let's dive into first. I want to really know about what brought you to the world of health and wellness and nutrition, because you are an expert in the field, especially in our community, around nutrition and health and wellness. So what brought you here?
For me, it started probably when I was quite young, but I'd say my personal journey into sort of unraveling things probably started in my late teens and early 20s. So when I was younger, I was super sensitive to a lot of foods. I probably was instinctually turned off by things that weren't good for me. So as a young kid, I was super sensitive to dairy. The thought of like eating a McDonald's hamburger grossed me out, and I felt like there was something wrong with me, and I actually had to like direct myself into eating those things because I thought it was what people did, right? But instinctually, I kind of knew that all those things didn't work for me. And I was also quite sick often as a kid. I would have colds. I had mono for the better part of a year, which turned into a pneumonia. I'd say I had kind of some degree of chronic fatigue even after that. And I was put on one round of antibiotics after another. I was on allergy shots. So probably every time I got a cold, my whole microbiome would get wiped out. And I was in a cycle of that all the time. So, I mean, I could go back and probably analyze what was going on just based on nutrition and all those things, but suffice it to say is like, I kind of was sick all the time and just thought that was normal. And our good family friends were doctors. So we would just go visit the doctor and our friend all the time. And that was just the pattern, right? People just kind of gave you a pill for things, or that thick, syrupy, purple cough syrup, all of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, even despite that, I probably didn't have the most unhealthy childhood. Like my mom made homemade food, and even in the 80s, she was pretty conscious about, we'd go to the health food store, she would make, tofu and stuff for us. So she was kind of onto things, but that's still in the scope of the 70s, where you go to the grocery store and like vegetables were apples and oranges and iceberg lettuce. And, even though and fortunately my Jamaican father, we would go to the fruit market and we'd hand pick out mangoes and plantains and all the yummy fruits and stuff like that. So, even despite my illness, we were fairly healthy on a relative scale.
And so you have a brother as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And was he also quite sick as a child, or was
Not
he?
as much. No,
No.
I was definitely kind of more sensitive, and he wasn't he I don't recall him being kind of as much like me. And I also feel like for part of it, it was like I wasn't in my right environment. Like I was growing up for the most part in suburbia. Um, I hated being in school in a fluorescent building all day long. I felt it just made me feel sick, you know. So, you know, and as I got older and into my adult life, I found my place in nature and in the outdoors and in British Columbia and just all of those things that didn't exist for me. So when I was a kid, you know, I would go to the park and I would like climb trees and I'd hang out there by myself, or I would get on my bike and bike down to Lake Ontario, which wasn't that far from me, but it's like a polluted beach that you can't actually go in the water. So like I would seek it out, you know, in our summers we would spend up in Northern Ontario and I would go to a cottage or I'd go to summer camps. And so that was a great place for me for sure. But it wasn't until I moved away and moved out west that I kind of got fully immersed in what I would say is like a healthy environment for me. And then also I was a gymnast when I was younger. So from a very young age, I got put on a scale. And so probably when I was like 75 pounds, I was told how much I weighed. And I was probably in a growth spurt. So every week we would get put on the scale. And then, you know, a week later I'd be 2 pounds heavier and then 2 pounds heavier. And so right away I became very conscious of my weight. So I was, you know, tweaking what I would eat based on my weight at a super young age. So I kind of had this disordered relationship with food. One, because it didn't make me feel good. And two, because I was trying to sort of not get bigger as a child, which is so dysfunctional.
And that
And
was
then
the way it was at that time too. Like I know for sure now it is that way in certain gyms, but I mean,
it's not the same.
no, my girls are in gymnastics, and the thought of anybody ever putting them on a scale, like I'd be like, that is
Oh yeah.
criminal.
It's
Yeah.
so much more body positive and healthy. And you know, it was just, you know, it was like in the area of like Russian gymnasts and like Nadia Comaneci and
Comaneci,
all of it,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I got out of gymnastics kind of in my early teens, and I actually did not menstruate until I was probably like the second last girl in my grade at the time. So
Yeah.
my body was kind of stunted. And then I probably started menstruating, I think it was probably like grade 10, 11,
Oh, wow.
which
Yeah.
is like ridiculously late for even compared to girls in this area, which is in this era, which is crazy. And then I kind of had a few years where I wasn't too much into that. And then later I got into rowing, which I don't know if how much you know, but there's sort of lightweight and heavyweight rowing.
Oh,
And
I had no
so
idea.
as a lightweight rower, you're 125 pounds or less. And so again, like as it later in my teens, I was like back on the scale and having to be a certain weight. So that kind of reinvigorated that sort of fixation around food. And then that got into sort of calorie restriction. So I was eating like healthy, like I would eat fruit and stuff, but then that was the area where you could get like 0-calorie soups and all of this ridiculousness, right? So there was just kind of this constant manipulation, and then probably like laxative use and caffeine, just like whatever I could do, but like not really be a full-on anorexic, you know?
Right.
And so I
Yeah.
was training, you know, several times a day, whether it was in the boat or whether it was in the gym, whether it was running. And again, I went years where if I was in kind of peak training, I wouldn't be menstruating.
Wow. So you were
Um,
right. You know, what I see with our clients is when they're not menstruating, we see that there's always generally a stress on their body. And
oh yeah,
by switching them on to really nutrient dense food, within 2 weeks, they start menstruating regularly. Like I
all
even
right.
had women who've never had their period, even as 40-year-olds, who, you know,
Oh,
switched to nutrient dense food that we teach and metabolic nutrition. All of a sudden they get their period for the first time. So we see
mhm.
that direct relationship with, you know, physical stress, emotional stress, and nutritional stress on what that has in the body. But to see that you've experienced that as well as a result of, you know, the training you did just shows that you're probably right on the cusp there, right? Like walking a fine line.
Yeah, and also just like the negative self-talk around the body, like that your body, like, you know, so it's like in sports, or I think even in magazines back then, there was this kind of idea that men had speedier metabolisms than women, and it was easier for them to lose weight. And so like there was kind of like this hatred toward, like this kind of battle going on with my body, like that it was working against me or it wasn't working for me, or how can I be doing all this and like not losing the weight or whatever it was. Like there's kind of like this, like, and in retrospect, it's so shocking to me to just even have that dialogue going on in your head where you're basically hating your body as if it's like this other thing.
Yeah.
And so later, like probably later in my teens, I started getting like just like violent bloating, and you know, that probably had a lot of things to do with a lot of things, but at the time, you know, probably in the late 80s, even my mom had seen a naturopath or somebody who had kind of gotten her onto this concept of gluten-free food. And so she'd started making like these, you know, gluten-free flour mixes, and she'd make muffins and stuff. So I became aware of the fact that like gluten sensitivity was a thing, which at the time wasn't super popular. And that was right about the time that I kind of moved out here and was living on my own. And so there wasn't like gluten-free food, so to speak, right? But I would find like, you know, brown rice cereals or corn chips were gluten-free. And so I kind of was like trying to figure out what to eat and avoid those things. And then that probably slowly got me onto like macrobiotic eating. And then I could always go to East Indian restaurants, and so kind of vegetarian food. And I just started kind of learning more and more about nutrition by just sheer necessity of having to find other ways to eat. And then little things would happen. Like I was somewhere talking to this man, and he just was like, have you ever tried spirulina? And then I had friends that were into blue-green algae. So then that kind of just like put me on a little bit of, you kind of get into the world that way. And then I remember being on a trip in Guatemala and going into this really sweet little herbal store. And like, there was all of these herbs, and there's no laws there. So under each herb and plant, there would be a description of all the benefits for it. And so I was like, it opened up this whole world of like, amazing that you had these alternatives to all of these horrific medicines that I've been taking my whole life. So even like when I went down there, people were getting vaccines for malaria and stuff like that, which I didn't get. But then you're down there, I'm like, there's a herb for malaria, right? Like there's things for everything. And so that just kind of opened me up to like, I don't need to go down that route ever again. And so, I mean, that was like almost 3 decades ago that kind of started, but that led me, you know, through studying Ayurveda, through studying microbiotics, to getting into herbology, to, you know, essential oils, and getting into healing work. And then so I would just seek out healers wherever I would go. And whenever I travel somewhere, I'd find some kind of crazy healer that was there, or somebody that was practicing yoga out of their basement or whatever. So I would just learn all these teachings, and I kind of was just like voracious for knowledge. So I just buy books and buy everything. And then, you know, I had a girlfriend that I spent 3 months in Alaska with fishing, and it was a really bad fishing year. So we would just, you know, we spend a lot of time, we would go to yoga, we would go for rolfing sessions, we did workshops with these South Americans that came up to teach flower essences. And then she had Crohn's disease. So we would just spend a lot of time at this natural food market. We had all of our health books and Ayurveda books. And so I would make food for her, and we were all about balancing our doshas. And ultimately, it was probably Ayurveda that cured her of her Crohn's disease. So I would just dive deep into all these things and do kind of my own healing detective work. And
well,
then
I just want to jump into that, to hold that thought there, because there's 2 parts about this. Like for our listeners, you know, if you're hearing this, you know, there's 2 things about Sarinda. So number 1, it's this intuitive side of you that, you know, knows that something's not right. Like, you know, that your diet potentially is connected to your health. Because how many people have you met, Sarinda, that, you know, have all of these issues, and then you say, well, have you considered your diet? And they're like, well, what's diet got to do with it?
Oh yeah, for
Like,
sure.
right. People just don't make the connection between food and their symptoms, because we've been raised in a society that says, well, if you have symptoms, then the answer is drugs, medicine, what your GP says. But they won't even stop to think that it could be their sleep, their stress, you know, predominantly their diet. and nutrients that they're maybe missing and toxicity. But meanwhile, they just keep trying to look for the next medication, the next medication. And then the second part that I just really love about, what you touched on there is that, first of all, your intuition was strong. And then the second part is that you're knowledge hungry. And, like that to me is one of the pieces that I find with my clients are the ones that are the most knowledge hungry are the ones that get results and will find that cure and the ability to overcome their disease. Like you have, and it seems to me like you had two of these factors, which I don't know, was that part of your personality? Is that something that you had to learn along the way? Like,
I mean, I've always been super curious, and I think I went through so many, like, and we'll get to this probably more in the sense of like identity and culture and all those things, but I think I had just so much internal like pain and discomfort, just like emotionally, which came out probably in the way I treated myself physically, but they all kind of wove together and evolved into, we'll get to that, later on. But like, I think it just, there was definitely a breaking point. I remember I'd gone to McGill for a year. I'd come out to Whistler in the summer. I went back to Montreal. And then after a few weeks of being there, and again, I was rowing at the time. So I was like getting up super early in the morning. I was going and training. I'd go to the gym. I would run for 2 hours. My knees were wrecked. Like I was just such a wreck. And I was so unhappy. Like, I mean, I loved the rowing, but it was like at school, I was pretty miserable. And just, I broke down. Like I literally had like a full, like I was crying for days. It was just like, it was like all of the emotion of my youth and my high school years kind of just came to a head. And I remember just thinking, I'm only going to do what feels good right now. Like I'm only going to be in pursuit of what nourishes my heart. And I knew that I felt so good when I was in British Columbia. And so I literally like got back either on a plane or in a car with my friend. And like that January, I came back to Whistler. And so from then on, I was kind of like, I'm just going to pursue what feels good to me and what's right. And it's not like I felt better immediately, but I just kept on seeking out things that like resonated with my soul. And so that was just, and it was hard. Like that was never easy. Like all of those years, it was hard because it was like, there was always this voice of like, well, you should be at school. You're throwing away these things. Like you should be doing that. Like, what are you doing? And so there was just like these years of like struggling, but knowing that I was heading in the right direction. And so, yeah, I mean, and I was stubborn too. I mean, there was a point sort of like where I got super sick. I had this like in this cut on my knee that became infected, and it was like infected this went on for weeks and months. And I would put like these poultices on it and I would try everything. And, I was voraciously hungry. Like it was like, I was kind of, and that's not my typical thing. Like I just kind of was like almost wasting away. And that was when, and I had a couple of friends who had like a blood an illness that they'd come back traveling from. And my mom was really worried that I had like the flesh-eating disease. And she's like, you have to go see a doctor. I went to the doctor and he was like, you need to go on antibiotics. And he showed me like this book of like all these babies with impetigo and, told me that I had to take these drugs. So I took the bottle and I went home and I was just so stubborn that I refused to take them. And then somebody had recommended Jayashree Lambert. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's an Ayurvedic. So someone said I should go see her. So I went to see her in the city and she gave me like all these herbs.
Just explain who she is for our audience who's listening.
She's an Ayurvedic practitioner. And subsequent to that, I did train with her in Ayurvedic massage and all the treatments and stuff like that.
And just explain to people, because there's a lot of people who listen to our show that literally have never heard of chiropractic care, or they're afraid of it. They've never heard of Ayurvedic work. They think it's, hokey. So just like, let's explain to the audience what Ayurvedic medicine is.
Ayurvedic medicine would be traditional East Indian medicine. So there's a whole school of surgeries. It's based on prevention, your unique constitutions, herbs, nutrition, all those things. And so I was aware of it, but this was like the first time I went to see a practitioner and actually kind of her take my pulses and kind of suss out what was going on with me. And the doctor had said that I had some kind of strep or staph infection is what it was. And I don't know if I had the results from that test yet, but anyway, she gave me like all these herbs to take internally. She told me what to eat. So basically kitchery and then she gave me like this paste. And I think it was like that really fragrant neem oil with golden seal, which is a natural antibiotic, and a couple other things. And so I put that paste on my knee. I started, eating the kitchery, which is basically rice and lentils and spices. And within days, I felt better. And it completely cleared up. And this had been dragging on for months, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that just kind of reaffirmed to me like that's my medicine, right?
And the part about that too, that is, I love that you did that and that you tried it because, a lot of times too, we can look at these things and say, well, how does this powder paste that I'm going to put on my knee, how is that better than an antibiotic, right? Sure, it says it's antiviral or antibacterial but you went ahead and did it and you got the results from it. And one thing that we have to remember is that up until 100 years ago, or even less than that, like before antibiotics were discovered, we had to use all these other methods for like hundreds of thousands of years around the world. And these herbs have existed always, and people have used them as medicine always. But I love that you went and actually tried it and did that, because if you had actually gone the route of taking the antibiotics, like, we know how that decimates the microbiome and how it almost is like wiping you clean. And then you have to start fresh to build your body back up, which takes like almost 2 years after taking a round of antibiotics.
And nobody tells you that. No one tells you that if you, because of course it's great that we have like these antibiotics for extreme conditions and when you need them, but we know that we overdispense them, and then when they're used, nobody tells you how to, and I guess the awareness wasn't there. Like, just to be fair, the awareness about the microbiome was not there. It's not something that was heavily studied and like until the last few decades, really. So, now we have the knowledge and we should use it. But, so yeah, that, and then eventually I stumbled upon a book that I bought it because of the Ayurveda, but in the back of it, it had all these raw food recipes in it. And so I kind of slowly just started tinkering in the kitchen, and I would make things that I could make that didn't require a dehydrator or anything like that. And then I just started noticing that I started feeling better and better. Like all the little, like as much as I was doing well, it was like all the little glitches in my digestion and mucus and all the things just kind of cleared up. And like, I kind of had this very satiated feeling like that all of my cells were being nourished. And actually that came later because I had my kids before, but yeah, so this, like the whole process of sort of like health and nutrition just has continued to be refined. And, our bodies change over time. So it's like not one thing is going to work for you at all phases in your life, which I think is super important, right? Because we're different when we're children versus when we're teens versus when we're young adults versus when we're mothers. And again, and you could maybe relate to this, but it's like, because I had all of that time working up to the time when I got pregnant, by the time I got pregnant, I was like, and I had one girlfriend who'd been pregnant before me who had the Ina May Gaskin book, Spiritual Midwifery. And again, I was like, okay, so there's an alternative to childbirth too, and mothering, like, and that just took me down another rabbit hole of like all these beautiful women who had had natural births before me, and herbology around pregnancy and nutrition around pregnancy, and like this whole beautiful idea of just natural birthing, like we've done since the beginning of time. And this whole kind of Hollywood idea of like women screaming in pain with their feet in the air having babies was just like bonkers to me. And so again, I was like, okay, I've already avoided the doctors for the last decade. I'm not going to start going back to them now that I'm pregnant, because, and that was also kind of a reckoning with my body of like, all of a sudden I've got this thing growing inside of me that I'm going to nourish to the best of my capacity, and I'm not going to starve this thing. And I've got to get right with my body, and I've got to sort of get in line. So it really did sort of anchor me in my body. And it was kind of like the final piece of like, just being in my body and loving it and supporting it to the best of my ability. And so that was like such a gift and not something I could have ever imagined, because when you're like, the idea of like having a baby is just so foreign until you're kind of in that place
Yeah.
with it.
100%.
And again, to me, that's like, it's so shocking and heartbreaking how disconnected women are from birth. It's astounding to me, like how we outsource it to doctors and to experts and to books and to whatever. And it's like literally innate in our DNA to birth children. We're a mammal, and every mammal births a freaking baby, and we've managed to screw that up.
And that's the part that, I mean, I taught intuitive birthing classes for couples for years and years. And so I got to watch lots of babies be born. I got to watch lots of women, be pregnant. I taught prenatal for years. And you hit the nail on the head. Like, so many of these women were actually like pregnant and birthing in complete fear. And I get it. Like, it is a new experience, your body, even though millions of women have gone through it, and billions of women, I mean, your body's going through it the first time, but there was almost like no empowerment at all, because it had been stripped from us through the medical system. And by having experts and predominantly like white male doctors tell us what birth is, what it meant, how it's supposed to feel like, and then also what the birthing experience should feel like. And so these women literally were like, it was scarier to be pregnant and birth a child than it was for them to go bungee jumping, with a cord around their ankles. They would rather do that, no problem. And it just made me so sad. But with the work that I was able to do with them, I mean, we were able to, reinstill a little bit of that autonomy and power back in. But man, it's like, we almost all need to come together, and there's our women doing that, thank goodness, and there's midwives that are doing that, and doulas that are doing that, and practitioners that are doing that to help to bring back that power. But there's so much work needed in that area.
Yeah, and we've kind of medicalized midwifery again.
Totally.
We've kind of, it's good that we have the options now, but then those come with strings. And it's, again, it has to come from the woman as well. You know what I mean? As much as we can blame all these structures, it's like, until we're kind of like one with ourselves, it's like that's the only way we can take our power back, right? It's like we can blame institutions and all those things. And, I had choices and I made my choices, right?
Yeah.
Based on my own little bit of information that I had. And, fortunately, just, and I think, again, like, this comes back to being other, like, because being other my whole life, it kind of just allowed me the thing of like, well, I don't really fit into this anyway, so I'm just going to follow what feels right for me. And none of the institutions that I was raised around made sense to me. And so it was a really easy thing for me to not go that way. It's like, as a child sitting in church, I could not wrap my head around that. Sitting in schools, like, all of the things that kind of are normal institutions of our society just didn't sit well with me. And so pregnancy and birthing kind of, I just feel so grateful that I was around at least a handful of women who had done something different. And so the option was there for me of a way to do something differently. And I felt like on both occasions with both my births, I was in such great hands. And, I'm just so glad that opportunity kind of was there, and that I chose it. And then I was, subsequently surrounded by amazing women to raise my children around. And, I still am sad when I see that people aren't kind of surrounded by that. And I don't know how I landed in it, but I was so fortunate.
Well, I think you said it yourself, is that you chose it. And, I hear a lot, I like to listen to the language that people use. And a lot of people will say things like, oh, you're so lucky, or I wish I had this, or wouldn't it be so nice? But the reality is, is if you're wishing for something, then you have to take the action to make it a reality. I mean, we have so many similarities, you and I, and even though we've lived in the same community for so long, I mean, I wish we had just had way more time together, but we've just been in the throes of running businesses and children and just life, being even though it's a quiet community, it's still a really busy lifestyle. But same thing. And when you said, that being other, where you don't necessarily fit into the current systems that are in place for us, and you are always questioning them. And, I was very much in that place. But when it came to having kids as well, I remember specifically making the choice that I would raise my kids in community, like with girlfriends, and we would cook together, and we would put the babies to bed together, and we would nurse together. We would do all of those things. Like, I had a party at my birth pretty much. My girlfriends were there, along with my midwife. And it was so beautiful bringing a baby, like all three of my girls, into the world that way. And I feel sad when other women don't choose that for themselves. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see it as well. I hear that a lot of women say things like, oh, I don't want anybody to be in my birth because it should just be, me and my partner, and that's it, which I also understand that. But then I also see that carries on to not wanting to also raise the child with others present and
Mm-hmm.
around. It's almost like they feel that they have to be in their isolated home doing it themselves, following their own strict schedules, where I'm like, no, like, you can do this in community as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so you chose that for yourself. So even though you say you were fortunate, I mean, fortunate because you chose that
Yeah.
100%.
And it was really magical. And yes, of course I chose it, but it just, all the pieces were in place for it to happen the way it did. Yeah.
And then raising your kids. So let's just talk about raising your kids, like the nutritional side of that. How was that, and what kind of choices were you making for them? And how was that in
So
relationship to your community as well? Like with all the other, parents that were also raising their kids in and around your child.
right. So we, of course, like I was kind of already onto eating healthily and all those things. And so breastfeeding came as easy as breastfeeding can, despite the little glitches at the beginning. Like, I breastfed my kids, both of them, for the better part of 2 years. Like, my son definitely, and to this day, it's funny how they're all so similar. Like, he, even after a year old, he was barely eating every day. Like, I was like, oh, well, maybe we should give him some solid food today, but we'd forget. And he didn't seem to mind. And even to this day, he's not like this voracious eater, and then, so it just, it was whole foods. Like, that was like, there was no baby food or any prepared food, anything like that. Like, my midwife gave me like a sweet little food grinder, and we'd use that sometimes. And I think both my kids were different with their first foods, but just like, I think my son probably started eating more in the fall, so it was probably like sweet potatoes and that kind of thing, and like rice and just whatever it was. Neither of my kids had dairy when they were younger, and I really kind of avoided gluten with them, and like any refined sugar or anything like that. Um, and then as far as like animal food, I think that kind of came a bit later and not like as a focus, but yeah, like they kind of ate well-rounded. And then my daughter, who's definitely got more of an appetite and loves food, she was like quicker to get to like kind of reach out on the table and want food, and kind of sought it out. And she, again, her first foods were different. Like, they were like avocados and watermelon, like things that I probably ate when I was pregnant with her.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, both of my kids have never gone to the doctor for anything other than a few broken bones mountain biking, but they've never sort of like had any illnesses per se, other than like maybe a bit of congestion here and there from eating too much of like food that's not good. And then, that's usually quickly remedied with like a bath, some ginger tea, and, just really simple things. Rest. My son used to like beg me to miss school because all the other kids miss school all the time, and he was never sick to miss school. So he would just like take days and go skiing instead to make up for those days. But
That's
yeah, like
awesome.
and I think, I mean, from what I've noticed with kids is that you really, when you get to the idea of the microbiome and how you're basically feeding different things in yourself. So it's like if you're eating sugar all the time, then you're going to be feeding the sugar bacteria in your gut. And I think with kids, when you lay the groundwork early, then that's the bacteria, that's the microbiome that they develop, aside from the fact when you kind of impregnate, or when you kind of, what do you call the term, when you have a vaginal birth and you're sort of giving your kids that initial microbiome and an immune system through the delivery process. But it's like, and then whatever foods you start feeding them from the beginning. So if you're giving your kids processed foods that have all these things, then that's kind of the microbiome that they develop, right? So I found like my kids, they crave healthy food. And of course they go through like a phase probably at a certain point in their teens when they start breaking away from you and they can make their own choices and they go with their friends and, they want to try different things. And so they kind of try it, but they don't really have an appetite for it. They have a really good sense of how food makes them feel. And so they make like wise choices. And, they kind of, both of them have different constitutions, so different things that they crave or kind of imbalance them. And they just kind of have an intuitive knowing around it. And I feel like they're what we should all be, in the sense of like, they have an immune system that works, and, they're resilient, and, yeah, like they have a healthy relationship to their body and to food. And, it's interesting like to watch, because I look at their kind of childhood versus my childhood, or just the awareness that we as parents have now versus our own parents. And also they're exposed to, I think, which is cool with this generation, is that they're exposed to so much social media, and healthy food is trending.
Yeah.
So they kind of see, like, even like they'll see videos of like other kids or influencers making smoothies and healthy food. So it's like whatever I've been doing is only being reinforced, which is kind of cool. So it's not like there's anything, and I don't really impose anything on them per se, but it's like there's nothing really for them to rebel against, or it's
But I
just
also think though that is because you laid that groundwork, like you said. Like I often say, God, I wish I was a fascist and, I could dictate what kids should eat from, birth until at least they're 2 or 3 years old. So we can create that like healthy microbiome foundation and that good, healthy
right.
gut brain axis, and almost make it mandatory that kids are not allowed to have refined processed foods. Because once they get an appetite for, what a raw tomato or cooked tomato tastes like, or what a raw carrot or cooked carrot can taste like, then their brains are open to the textures and the flavors and the sights and the smells and colors and everything,
Mm-hmm.
instead of being afraid of them, which I also see a lot of kids that
Yeah, and I've seen that too.
don't eat fruits and vegetables, and they just haven't been exposed to it. But it's the part that you mentioned, even just about resiliency, like it's to lay that groundwork of resiliency so that things like, when the common cold comes, wafting through a town like ours, because it's a tourist, we live in a tourist zone. So we have millions of people coming through every year, bringing every type of illness you can imagine from every part of the world. But if you can keep your body and your immune system healthy and thriving, then you're not going to be susceptible to those illnesses and diseases. And so, or COVID, for example,
Well,
right? Like,
and I love that idea of like the terrain, right? It's like, just because we're all in the same room and the same bug comes to that room, we're not all going to get sick or express the illness the same way. Like I have been hands-on with other humans for over 25 years from all corners of the planet, up close and intimate, and I don't get sick,
yeah. Because you're
right?
teaching yoga, you're teaching nutrition classes, you're doing massage therapy and
Yeah.
healing work, and you are exposed to a vast variety of, bugs and viruses and everything when you're in contact with these people. So yeah, it really
Yeah. And
shows.
I mean, I'll get run down or I'll get tired, but I feel it immediately, and then I kind of course correct. So it's like,
Mhm.
if I feel that, my system's overwhelmed, it's like, I have to stop. I need to take a bath. I kind of just check what I'm doing and, check how I am emotionally. And then, you got to just keep, I just kind of see it as energy, right? And it's like, you just have to kind of keep the flow. And I think our culture is just so wired to think that it's like normal to get sick. It's normal to go, oh, that person is sick, so I caught it from them. Like, I never see somebody as being sick a threat to me. Like, I don't,
No.
it just does not compute to me that because that person has it, that I would get it. Like, I kind of just think that it's like, for the most part, and the way I see it with even in myself or my kids is like, it's kind of a process of elimination or detoxification. So it's like, if you're exhibiting symptoms of heat or fever or mucus or whatever it is, like, that's your body trying to regain homeostasis. It's your body working for you. So it's pushing out the mucus or the heat or whatever it doesn't want in it. And so whether that comes in acne or a rash or a cold or an ear infection and all of those other things that are secondary infections, like, that's because it's that deep. But that's not because you caught it from Joe down the street. Like, that's your own body reacting. And so, the more that's in there, the more there is to come out. And so you're receptive to that illness, either mentally or physically, whatever it is, right? And so, and again, I don't think being ill is anything to fear as well. It's like, it's just your body saying, hi, I'm working, we got to rest, right? And and it's like, even childhood diseases, like, they'll say it's like, that's a way for your body to, it's like a muscle strengthening, right? So it's like, we're so worried about our kids getting sick or the chicken pox or whatever it is, and like, your body needs to go through those processes to strengthen and to develop resiliency. And so we didn't evolve on this planet to be scared of every bug and disease. Like, we wouldn't have gotten this far if we'd been in a bubble.
No, and we
Right?
kind of are in a bubble right
We've
now.
created a bubble for ourselves right now, and it's
Yeah.
not, and every immunologist will say it's not healthy to exist in a bubble where you're not exposed to challenges to your system and to your immune system. Your immune system is a muscle that needs to be exercised just like every other muscle in your body. And so we've kind of created this fear-based reality where people are hiding and thinking that that's the answer. But as soon as they step out of that bubble, the planet is still going on as it is. And our planet is filled with viruses and bacteria and fungi that are always going to be there. And, even they've done research to show that, every time we disrupt nature, whether we're clear cutting or putting in highways or roads, we create more viruses. So to think that we can hide from them is completely absurd, right?
So
Like, we
what do
have
you
to be in
think?
relationship with them.
Well, exactly. And so now here we are in our COVID bubble. And, and so I just want to like touch on that a little bit from, what were your first thoughts when COVID hit and was in the news, to how did you and your family navigate through that? And then also, for a third question that I have for you is, what are you predicting for the future, like as a result of what's been happening right now in the way we have, isolated ourselves, and what is that, really going to mean for our immune systems, for our bodies, for our communities, and for our children, especially now that we're in this, crazy pandemic state?
Yeah, well, when I first heard about it, I mean, in general, I'm not really scared of most things, right? Like, it wasn't like, especially in the early days when people kept on talking about it, I was just like, okay, well, we've gone through SARS, we've gone through MERS, we've gone through H1N1. Like, I've been on the front line with all of these, not the front line as in the hospital, but I've been hands-on with people from all over the planet. And so I don't, I, for me personally, I wasn't sort of thinking that this was more of a threat to myself than anything. Um, and then we shut down everything and went into lockdown. So of course, my inquiring mind starts delving into everything that I can find out about it, and to listen to respected people that I respect on the topic. I listened to several epidemiologists and immunologists, and most of them had said, at the beginning of this outbreak, they think that yes, taking cautious measures that we did was a good first step, before they had the data once the data presented itself, it became more obvious that the numbers that came from the original prediction that was a computer generated model were far, far off, and that we're at that 0.0 whatever percent that it is. And so the threat of death from this disease, or the people that it was affecting, is generally people with more compromised immune systems and people with several comorbidities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, again, that whole idea of terrain.
Exactly.
Supporting the illness. And then, also saying that, quarantine is intended for sick people, not for well people. And that even children who have been shown not to be, spreading the disease, there's even been studies to show that asymptomatic people aren't spreading the disease. The collateral damage of the lockdown is quickly surpassing probably what we're going to see as a mortality rate. And we'll see this play out, and of course, I'm not an expert on that. But so our take initially was obviously just kind of, ground out at our home. And I love being at home with my family. It gave us a time to rest. Gave us time to start the garden and grow food and eat healthy food all the time. And that's a privilege, which I'm super grateful for. And then I love medicinal mushrooms, and I love having, we make lots of like shots with ginger and turmeric and natural antibiotics and antivirals. And so just like clean food and all the yummy supplements that we have around anyways. I did consult with a homeopath who gave me the whole protocol, because at the time we were supposed to go to Jamaica. So I wanted to kind of have a little arsenal of stuff. So I had a little, homeopathic first aid kit if anybody should get sick. So yeah, we just take care of ourselves. And again, it's all about cultivating resiliency. So that's all we can do. And for me, it's easy to quarantine. I don't have a problem with that. I don't like, there's the part of me that doesn't think it's healthy for society, but as far as my own personal life, I don't have a problem with that. I do. The one obvious thing to me was A, the fear that's being perpetuated in the media, B, that not one person has talked about wellness at all, and that you're like these at-risk populations are lifestyle diseases of diabetes and heart disease and all of the things that we know. And also a lot of those areas where the hugest outbreaks were, which were areas of high pollution in China, in Italy, New York City. Zach Bush is an amazing guy to listen to on that topic, which I love everything he has to say. And from a lot of people I've heard from, we're going to cycle through these pandemics, however you want to call them, and these viruses coming out because we've done such a destructive thing to the planet. And so, I think on a collective scale, it's kind of like we're all going through this illness and detoxification. And, so I think there's beautiful silver linings to all of this, because it's kind of created this whole level of awakening about all of the weaknesses in our culture, whether it's health, whether it's politics, whether it's racial issues, all of the things. And so I do think it's a really great, necessary purge. The way it's being dealt with is questionable, because our way of dealing with things is to try to engineer things. Like we've tried to engineer nature, and we've tried to engineer medicine, and now we're trying to engineer a cure to a disease that we've created essentially with our mismanagement of the planet in the first place. So it's to me, I think since the beginning of this, there's a couple narratives going on. There's the narrative of the media, and then there's what's really playing out. And so I think, unfortunately, most people have one source of information that guides their thought process. And so people are really in a state of fear. Like, this is something that has never hit the planet, and since the beginning of time, that we can't handle. That this somehow is something different that warrants us shutting down the planet and hiding in our homes until somebody saves us. And I don't really think that approach is Like if you
Well,
look at the trajectory of that approach, is that means that we'll never leave our houses and that this will be a new normal, which is nowhere near normal.
well, and this is the part right now that, I mean, there's a few things that you touched on. One piece I want to go back and just touch on is the fact that I love how you said that you were supposed to go to Jamaica and you went and saw your homeopath and they gave you your kit, right, to travel with. And that is a very proactive approach. Like I don't go anywhere without my homeopathic kit as well. And I often, you know, have said this in podcasts that, you know, my kids have had fevers and I welcome fevers, you know, all the time, because I'm like, it shows that the body is responding to whatever is, you know, happening inside and around the body. But we would give them homeopathy to manage the fever, not to make it go away, but just to make, you know, our child's body or my husband's body, you know, be able to handle it well so that it can use the fever to do what it's supposed to do with regards to, you know, what's happening in the body. So that's a very proactive approach that I think people need to really learn to do, instead of saying, well, I'm going to go away, I'm going to get sick, and then they're going to reach for the NyQuil or the cold and flu medication or the Tylenol or the Motrin or whatever it is, as opposed to, you know what, anticipate that these things can happen. What are the natural things that you need to have in your kit? So I love that you said that. So I just want to touch on that. But going back to these narratives that are happening around COVID as well, the fear around this is, you know, you touched on that. And what's happening is that, you know, we have this mass oppression happening around COVID where, you know, here we have everything that happened with George Floyd and what that has resurrected, and which is so important. And we're going to get into that in a bit, but that's about liberating people from oppression, suppression, repression. And here we have this mass oppression happening around, you know, waiting for that knight in shining armor to show up to find the cure for this virus. And so what do we do with this? Like it's crazy what's happening at this exact moment in history where we have these two things happening where we're trying to liberate, but then meanwhile being suppressed entirely. And so let's chat about that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I mean, on the surface, it's like some things are glaring. It's like that we're silencing so many doctors. Like so many doctors have come forward that are questioning how we're handling this. Like, and doctors without agendas, you know, like, and we're silencing them either because we're not putting their voices on the media, or we're actually censoring them and deleting them from the media. So there's only one allowable narrative right now. And we're using celebrities to tell us how to behave, which is, you know, that we've gone into dark territory when we're silencing doctors and scientists and elevating celebrities to speak. Yeah. So that's one thing. It just, okay. So getting into the current state of, you know, looking at race and, you know, racism and all those things, it's like, one of the things that is so interesting is that on one hand, yes, okay, so when we look at race and racism, it's like, we can say that race doesn't really exist, right? Like there's different ethnicities, we're all of the human race. So we are all born vibrating beings equal on this planet, which we are not, right? Like you could say that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but certain people are having a very racialized experience, which is very different from other people, right? And so with this recent killing of George Floyd, there's been this whole new revival and awakening and awareness. So for eons, people of color, Indigenous people have been fighting for civil rights and liberties and, you know, to be, you know, all of the things. And then all of a sudden now there's this new wave of awareness from the more white population about these things, right? So that's beautiful, right? There's been a lot of awareness. There's been a lot of controversy even amongst that, because there's a whole other political narrative going on as well. But just even if we're going to take something away from this, I think, you know, there's always like, so when this happens, people want to bring in diversity. So it's like, they want to bring in people of color into their ad campaigns. They want to give them a seat at the table, which I personally do not want to be at the table. And there's this need to kind of like diversify the look of things, right? Or, we even have philanthropists who can remain unnamed who are doing such good work on the planet, and even to be giving scholarships to people of color to put them into great universities, which again is, you could say is tokenism. You could say it's just like you're putting them in your structure. And so true diversity, I would say, is a diversity of things. Like you could even just put it in the education system. So we have a certain perspective on what education is and what is knowledge, right? And that's based on this, sort of standardized education system that we have right now. But we discredit and we don't acknowledge like the wealth of knowledge that exists in Indigenous populations. So, and that's diversified all around the planet of different knowledge. It's like, do you think that somebody who's gone to Harvard and studied plants knows more than an Indigenous person who's been living in the Amazon for generation after generation and knows those plants on a visceral level, and like not a book? They didn't study it in book. They've literally had their hands and they've been vibrating with these plants forever. So like, that's just two kinds of knowledge. Or even medicine. Like right now we're being corralled into one form of medicine that we all have to comply to, when there's systems of medicine as diverse from Russia to South America to India to China, which are literally either suppressed, they're made illegal, we can't use them, they're said to be quack medicine, and we actually, our choices are being limited about what medicines that we can use and what medicines are considered safe and effective. Us having a foundation of health also is something that's going to prevent us getting a disease, spreading a disease. And they've actually said that those things don't have a place. So instead of just saying like, well, vitamin C doesn't cure COVID, it's like it doesn't have a place. But if you actually use all these different modalities and have a good immune system, then chances of you contracting or having a severe reaction to any virus is going to be limited. So but they have a place.
Exactly. But even just, touching on vitamin C here is, there was that division basically of art and science, or Indigenous ways of knowing, and then what came to be known as the scientific method. And this mass division that almost said that, well, knowledge doesn't exist until it's been scientifically studied. But then it's also, we have to think about, well, who's designing the study? And how are they carrying that out? So let's talk about vitamin C. When you look at the studies around vitamin C, there's 100,000 ways that you can conduct a study around vitamin C. But then all of a sudden, when someone says, well, vitamin C isn't effective, and the rest of the population says, well, vitamin C isn't effective because the scientists said that it's not effective, but nobody wants to look at how the study's designed. And then you realize, well, they were using what kind of vitamin C were they using and what were they not using, but also how much were they using and what form of it? Was it, synthetic form? Was it, just somebody eating a bunch of oranges? Or, that's the thing, is that for anybody who's listening to this, where the first thought that comes into your mind is, well, if there's not a scientific study done on it, then it can't be knowledge, versus, well, what about, like you said, all of those other ways of knowing, or other ways of studying, or other ways of holding knowledge and attaining knowledge? That is also valid. And I love the point that you brought up about, tokenism versus, what does it look like to truly be a diverse, caring, spiritual, accepting, and maybe accepting is not even a good word, but, or I don't even know what words to use in this day and age right now. Inclusive, I don't think that's the word to use either. But, how do we move forward in the future where we are literally one race made up of many cultures and ethnicities that are all valid and right and just, and, we can truly embrace that. And so, there's so many areas that we can discuss here, but I do want to go back to how, when we chatted the other day, and one of the reasons why I said, like, oh my God, we have to talk about, like, have you on the podcast talking about that, is because we have to tell your story and my story in context, because you are half Jamaican and you are also half white, right? Your mother's white. What's her ethnicity, your mom?
Scottish, Dutch, German,
And your dad is
Jamaican.
Jamaican, right?
Yeah.
And so I have the opposite. So where my mom is half Black, half Indian, so born in Malawi, and then my grandfather's from Pakistan, but my dad is Austrian, through and through, Austrian blood, white, blonde hair, blue eyed. So we're just the reverse. And so we talked a little bit about that when we were at the farmers market. What was that like growing up, mixed race, being half Black, half white? And your mom, actually, because she was at the farmers market, I love the question that she posed to you while you were growing up, was just to ask you, like, what is it like being you, growing up in this society? So I want to touch on that because I want people to dive into what that looks like. And then I want to touch more onto, Black Lives Matter, and talking about, how can we move forward, in our society and with others around this.
Okay. So, yeah, I don't want to forget, because coming back to now and to be able to, because of, I just want to, so we don't forget, but just the controversy right now about whether this whole race thing is a relevant conversation or whether it's a big distraction, because there's so many narratives about this and about Black Lives Matter and the source of their funding and yada, yada, yada. But I honestly think it's like, to heal, we need to acknowledge trauma. And so clearly there's a massive portion of the population that's in pain. And until we acknowledge that pain, and that doesn't mean that we have to get into this victimhood or blame or the whole song and dance, or that someone's right or someone's wrong, but we need to acknowledge what's been done to people, right? And people have to feel that. And that's not just like a once overnight thing. And so it's a process and it's going to take time. But my experience, it was funny because I don't remember my mom posing that question, but she had said that when she asked me what it was like, I said, I feel like I'm white with Black relatives, I think is what she said that I said. And it's funny because growing up in a pretty white environment, like I remember in my elementary school, the first school I went to, there was a couple Black kids, kind of, I think, and then I ended up going to French schools mostly. So at one French school, it was quite international, actually. Like there was Iranian kids, Armenian kids, Pakistani kids, French kids. And so that was cool because I was kind of exposed to different people. So it was like, I was different, but there was other different people. And then for several years, I was at a very Jewish school. And then I was at a very, very white, like girls private school. Okay, so I kind of went through a different spectrum of things. But from the beginning, first of all, I grew up in the 70s where my name is Sarinda. Everybody had rulers and pencils with their names on them, like Karen and Christine and Jennifer. And I never had a ruler with my name on it, right?
Yeah.
And I was surrounded, I would always look at these girls that were like, blonde and blue-eyed and, just that all-American kind of look. And that was presented in media. And so I always kind of felt like that was the norm that I was supposed to fit into, right? And I just wasn't quite right. Like my hair was kind of kinky and my nose was so different. And so I kind of was always like trying to, that was the thing that I was kind of aspiring, isn't the right word, but that's what I thought I was. I didn't fit into that. And it wasn't until, I don't know if it was like the late 80s or early 90s where you started to see Black models like Naomi Campbell and Iman. And one of my friends from high school, her sister was one of those models. She was Jamaican. And so it wasn't until then, like, so into my teens that I started to see somebody who kind of looked like me. Like I was still somewhere in the middle, but I was like, okay, like they've got more of the features that I have. And so it was kind of like, that was like affirming to some degree, but there was kind of this constant feeling of like, no matter where I was like the other kid. When I was in a French school, I was the English kid. When I was the Jewish kid, I was like the not Jewish kid. And then when I was in this very waspy white environment, like I wasn't that either. And, just be like, by virtue of the fact that, my dad was a judge, I was kind of like accepted into this privileged sort of world, but I never felt like that was my world. So I was kind of like, that's not me, and so there was always like this feeling of like, I don't really belong in any of these places, nor do I, like, there was, I think, probably a period where I wanted to be part of that reality to some degree to fit in, because I think that's just human nature to want to fit in, to the point where I was like, I don't like this world. Like, I don't like this feeling. What I think that privilege and wealth does to people is it insulates people from the reality of the world. And so I always felt so much more at ease, like when I was traveling and I was like in a third world country, and I was like, oh, this is people, like this is how people live. Like, they're rooted, they do real things, and they have real life and real problems, and they're not just living in these big homes insulated from reality. And it was like that I wanted to be so far away from that reality, that because it just never felt right to me. And I see how that is going on now. Like, that's that idea of like people coming up to me that have known me forever and have been completely oblivious to there's this thing of privilege or white privilege. And I hate all those terms because I feel it's so reductive, and it's like there's so much like attached to them. But it's kind of like this sense of people not realizing that we have a dominant culture that the rest of us fit into.
But this is like the way, even just the language that you're using now, I know is brand new for a lot of people, where they would, you would say power over, for example, or privilege. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? But they don't see it because of the fact that they've just lived their whole entire lives in that place. And so for them, that unless you have something to compare it to, then you can't see that it's even there, or that it's happening, or anything like that. And without being exposed to, I still meet people today that, I'll talk about residential schools, and they'll be like, what's a residential school? Like, they don't know anything about Canadian, First Nations history and Indigenous history. And, they'll make comments like, well, that happened so long ago. What's the big deal? Why can't they just get over it? And I hear comments like that. But but that was the thing that, chatting with you in the farmers market, it was like, oh my God, a relief that we can chat about, use this language, but actually truly know what it means and what it refers to. So we have an issue with language in our society. We have an issue with lack of knowledge in history. We have an issue with, and I don't even know what the first step is to moving to a place where, because it's a journey. It's not that you can just force feed information to people in a class in university or in high school or in elementary school. It's a process of being able to hear it, have some exposure to it, start to taste it, sense it, smell it, and then it becomes you. And then all of a sudden your worldview starts to shift, right? It's not something that you can just, for example, have a Black person on your podcast or your website, and all of a sudden it's like, well, now, I'm not part of that old story and old narrative.
It's so deep, right? It's so deep. And I think I would even argue that so many people of color are only waking up to their history.
And I grew up too in a, I grew up very much in, in a school where it's predominantly like 99.9% all Caucasian students. There was one Chinese kid. His name was Man. There was myself. I was basically the token Black kid. People used to, I'd be walking down the street and somebody would yell out the street and be like, hey, Hindu. And I'd be like, are they talking to me? Because sometimes I'd even forget that I, didn't have white skin. And even now, like, as all of this happened, one of the things you said at the market the other day, and that exactly the same thing happened to me, is that, when everything with George Floyd's murder happened, and then all of the social media that happened, but not one person called me or said to me like, "Hey, Nikki, like, what is it like to be a Black person?" Which I thought that was interesting for your mom to have asked you that as a kid, because even my mom never asked me that. Like, what is it to be you, Nikki? Growing up in an all-white neighborhood and an all-white school and an all-white society. And I was never really asked that. But then what I realized is one of the reasons why I wasn't asked that by my friends is because they actually only just realized I was Black and
Yep,
Indian. They
yep.
were just like, "We kind of thought you're white, but just with dark skin."
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because like I heard a woman saying how it's like as a person of color, you spend your whole life learning how to be white, basically. But
Mhm.
it's not a reverse thing. Like unless you're a white person living in Africa, you don't really need to understand the culture. You are the culture. And we've
Yeah.
spread the culture around the world. That's called colonialism because
Yeah.
we've gone and we've, carved up Africa. We've kind of extracted from cultures all around the world. And we've kind of spread this narrative of white culture. And so for all of us, it seems normal. And most people, don't understand history. And not that, I mean, we none of us know the history, right? Because the history was written by the people who won, right? And
Yeah.
so, we have an idea that all blacks came over on slave ships, but there were black people in the Americas. So, and we have this idea that blacks were slaves as if they had no other identity, as opposed to kings and queens in Africa who had advanced knowledge, or that even that there were civilizations before our civilization that was far more advanced than what we are right now.
Yeah.
And we think that we're like at the pinnacle of of evolution right now, and we've got the sickest people living on the planet, we've got the highest suicide rates, we have most people medicating just to be alive on the planet right now, either for
Mhm.
emotional issues or physical issues. And we think that this is advanced civilization, and that the people running the show, like as if the highest office in North America is like the person who's the leader of the planet, basically, and like that's supposed to be representative of like mass like enlightenment and technological advance or something. And it's kind of like we and I think it all comes down to, I love the idea that that the apocalypse is the lifting of the veil. And I think that we are kind of just been pushed into this mass awakening right now, which is so
Mhm.
destabilizing and so confusing because everything's coming up and everyone's trying to grab onto a narrative and figure out what's going on. But I really do think that it comes down to personal responsibility and personal healing. So it's like until you can kind of step back and go, okay, like who am I in this whole mix? Like, where did I come from? Who are my parents? What was my history? What do I believe to be true on the planet right now? What am I basing my knowledge on? Like, just trying to make sense of it. And I think if you've never done that or never kind of had a, dark night of the soul where you've actually considered anything, then that can be really kind of destabilizing. But, I don't think we're going to move forward until we can see the interconnectivity of all things. And even to the fact that, we're kind of just looking at like, oh, we've been oppressing these Black people and we should treat them better. But it's like extend that out of Canada, out of United States, like to what's going on in Africa. Like,
Mhm.
we see people that are warring tribes in Africa, but why are like, who gave them the guns and why are they fighting? And while they're fighting, are we stealing their resources?
Yeah.
Like, where do our cell phones come from? Like, we've been able to insulate ourselves from the suffering of everybody else on the planet. And I think that is a major disease. And if you look at the like, I don't see like like this idea like of white supremacy or like a superior class or privilege, I think is really, even those words are crazy because I don't see those people as privileged or best, right? Like there's
Exactly.
trauma in that existence. It's like not like there's somebody winning in this. Like we're all kind of screwed right now because the planet is suffering and we're the ones that will go down, all of us as a collective. It's not like white people or Black people or that any of this is going to pick a color, right?
No.
So when you look at the levels of anxiety and stress in the dominant culture, that isn't indicative of disease, right? And that's indicative of the fact that we've we've put the pain over there on other people and thinking that it doesn't affect us when it affects all of us. Like, not one thing is not connected in this. And so I think, hopefully the longer this goes on, we can start to see how we've set up the planet, and how, like, even the notion of the fact that, we're trying to protect something that we have over here, like that we're going to fight other people on the other side of the planet to protect what we have. Like, there's such an excess on the planet that it's even such a crazy notion that we're fighting other people so that we can be better off. Like, how does that even make sense? And how do we even, like, where do we draw those lines? Like, where do we decide that those people's lives are worth less than our lives over here in the West? Like, how can we go, those people or their way of life is a threat to our way of life, and we don't agree with it, so we're going to squash them.
Well, I think you touched on it with, you had mentioned about, questioning, like, how do I know what I know, or, where I come from, or just even looking back in our own histories and understanding our own histories, I think allows us to, because there's been oppression and suppression and repression all throughout every culture, right? Every gender, every animal species on the planet at some point, every, piece of nature has experienced that. And to understand your own culture and question yourself and what you've come to know. And I think a really easy way to do that is, and I often had to do this when I was in university in Mississippi. People often say, like, what brought you to Mississippi? And I was like, well, I went to play tennis and it had a good business school. And, I could have gone to the University of Hawaii or University of Illinois. And I ended up going to, Mississippi. And it was the best experience because I got to see complete segregation. I got to be in the Bible Belt of the United States, where it's, again, like, you could be talking about race, but, like, let's just talk about religion, like, where it's like the Methodists and the Protestants and the Baptists and the Anglicans, like, everybody's at war with each other and everybody feels like, well, no, my religion is better. But I would always end up in these conversations because, white people would be talking about the Black people in some of the most craziest racist ways, and the Black people would be talking about the white people exactly the same way. And because nobody knew if I was Black or white, coming or going, they just would tell me everything. So I got to get filled up on all sides and really got to see the intense segregation right down to the cafeteria. You'd go in there and the left side would be all the Black people and the right side would be all the white people. And I'd be like, I don't know where to sit. But, being in these conversations, it was amazing because it was literally like being a fly on the wall. And the question I would always ask was, well, how did you come to know that? Like, one girl on my tennis team would talk about how her granddaddy had all these slaves and they loved being called the N-word. And I was like, really? How did they love to be called? Like, how did you know that? Like, really, who told you that? Well, my grandfather told me that. Well, who told him that? Well, and then you can keep asking yourself that question. Or about religion, where it's, unless you accept yourself as, I'm not religious, so I'm probably going to get this wrong, but accept yourself as, one of God's saviors, I think, then, if you don't do that, then you're going to hell. And I would say, well, how do you know that? Well, because it just is. Well, no. Somebody must have, taught you that. Who taught you that? Well, my grandparents and my, great grandparents and my Baptist minister and, my church community. And okay, well, how did they come to know that? And then there you come to a place where it's like, oh, I actually don't know how they came to know that. So then where are you getting your actual true real knowledge from? Is it just because somebody said that that's the way it is? So I think that, part of that healing process is potentially going back and keep asking until you hit that wall. And then once you hit that wall, that's when you get to actually truly start digging and come up with a foundation or a system or a place where that knowledge came from. And you start to see things like you said, that actually there were Black queens and kings and emperors and rulers, or that even in India, women were the superior gender and they were the rulers in India at one point, until there was, colonization came through and there was, wars, and then all of a sudden the women were suppressed, and then all of a sudden it was the men who understand all these things, right?
And there's been so many different iterations of things, right? Even like even right now, this idea of, people will argue that at a certain point there was just different ethnicities around their planet. There wasn't this whole idea of like one being superior to another. Like maybe they were a threat because you wanted what they had or whatever it was, they had land. But, even in the States, people will argue that, back in the day, there was like privileged white people, but there was also poor white people who had a lot in common with poor Black people. And so those people were a strong force together. But once you start giving some privileges, a few more privileges to the white people, and then create more privilege for them, then you can separate them from the Black people and create this animosity between the two groups so that you've got more leveraging power, right? So it's like we give little, special prizes to, those maybe poor white people so that they become, the white privilege in a way, right? And so it's like, just looking at the fact that we have all these social constructs set up. And it's not to say that you can't break through, but you can break through into the dominant narrative, right? So of course you have wealthy Black people and people of color, but they're operating in that dominant narrative, right? And, so it's like, it's, I don't know, it's interesting right now. And I think it's like, so people have to, ultimately, I do think there's kind of like one truth, which is like deeper. It's beyond all these conversations in a way. And it's like, if you even drill it back to our biology, it's like, I think of our bodies as like these ecosystems, right? So it's like, you've got this ecosystem of like bacteria and viruses and fungi and all the things that make us up. And, we're literally made out of like stardust, if you want to bring it down to that. Like, what are we? We're not even like this, all of this idea of like division and race and privilege and importance and, wealth and all of these things are just, they're constructs that we've created. And so, we're all just living in this story. And I think we're at this time where there's like a crack in the fabric of the story, and we've got to decide what's the new story that we want to be living in. And, for some people, it's going to be looking at, maybe the absurdity of the story and how that they're playing a part in a suppressive role on the planet. And, maybe they didn't sign up for that, and maybe they didn't knowingly sign up for that, but that's the way it's been rigged, and, I think it's challenging right now because there's so much noise out there. And once again, people are looking outwardly to find affirmation for some kind of hold on reality right now because it's super confusing. And, I think everybody's kind of got to step back and look at what's going on and, sort of come back to themselves a little bit to sort of break that down. And unfortunately, not everybody's, I remember Kristen Campbell said to me once, she's like, not everyone's a seeker.
No.
Right? So as much as we want everybody to have an awakening right now and to see what's up and to break this down and to, to move forward in a bigger way, most people are not having these conversations.
So for moving forward then, what are some of the things that you feel is important that we do either within our own families or within our communities, or for the people who are the seekers, what are the next step, for them? Because obviously we've seen like the immediate response was, okay, let's go on social media and put up a Black, image, and then that's it. And, a lot of people will think like, well, I've done my part. I didn't post on social media for a week. And, they copied and pasted, these social media posts, but like, there's a lot more that needs to be done. Obviously that.
And I think, I think there's a lot of people that are genuinely moving, like leaning into this in a positive way. Right. And that's a beautiful thing. That's all you can ask for. And I do feel like it's kind of created this in, Black, Indigenous, people of color, like it's kind of created a new sense of like we're not going to stand for this anymore. There's a little bit of like enough is enough. And whether people will argue that this is all politically motivated and a big distraction and it's election year and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. I do think it's kind of created this resilience in people, and it's given people that have been marginalized a voice right now. More people are kind of going, oh, we've been living like this, and this is absurd, and so I do think that there's been a shift and in that, and that's super important. um and I think that's one piece of it. I think, I don't know how much people have shifted their perspective on health in
Mhm.
all of this. Like, I don't know whether it's kind of made people go, oh, like, how resilient am I if something comes around? And what are my perceptions around health and how I can be healthy? And, am I waiting for the government to take care of me? Or, I see a lot of people still living in fear,
Mhm.
but I don't know if a lot of, like, I feel like my friends that are conscious that already are conscious of it, but I haven't seen that many people moving to the other side, but I don't know. um but it's hard to say. I feel like, again, it's we always center ourselves in this conversation as if, well, one, that we are going to we're going to change things, and I do feel like there's more to it, right? Like, we always forget that the plants have their own existence and the animals have their own existence, and plants are resilient to change and to climate change, which is inevitable. Whether we're here or not, there will be changes. And there's an intelligence in all these other things. And even if I always think of, like, like the the bacteria and all of the things in our body, it's basically life animating itself through us. And so whatever you feed and nourish is what you're cultivating in yourself. And so that's the resilience that you're going to develop. And that's kind of the expression of life that's coming through you, right? And you can either harness that, or you can block it, or you can suppress it, and you can create disease, or all of the things. But I just think that there's like an intelligence that's moving through the planet as well, that's going to wake us up, right? And so if you are, you know, in line with that, then maybe it'll help you cultivate resilience and to thrive through these times. And if you're not in alignment, maybe it's going to rock you the other way. And, it's like a meteor could take us out, a tsunami could take us out, like, and at the same time as the weather could take us out, our governments are manipulating the weather. So
Yeah.
it's like we're manipulating the weather, we're manipulating our own genetic makeup and our own DNA through our food and through pharmaceuticals. And so I'm always positive and optimistic about things. I just feel like um, there's something greater at play that we don't know of, and I don't think that that's a bad thing.
Mhm.
I tend to be more optimistic about things, and I think that's like I love the idea that um, we are, there's that saying of like, we're the daughters of the witches that they didn't burn. We are the seeds of our ancestors that survived. Like, we innately are survivors. We come from a race, or we come from a lineage of people that survived. And if you think about the fact that slavery went on for over 400 years, think about 400 years. Like, this is just recent history. Like, we're not even talking about things that have gone on in the past, but just like even more, recent Western history of like 400 years that people got up every morning and continued to live and to love and to have children and to make
Mhm.
food and to deal. And like, look at the glory that we're living in right now. We're not even having to deal with that. And it seems like that we're at this really intense time in history, which it is, but think about the lives that people lived and are still
Mhm.
living in different corners of the planet right now, and it's like, so I mean, I love that idea, and I think of Journey's movie always of like hope, right? It's like
Yeah.
people have always had hope, and that's what humans have, and that's what makes us persistent, and resist and continue to move forward and get up every day. um and
So
I
what
just
So that's one question that I want to ask you then, because I love that you brought up, just for your people who don't know what Sarinda was talking about, there's a wonderful, beautiful, incredibly intelligent, lovely human that graduated from the Waldorf School in Whistler, and she created, her name's Journey, and she created this beautiful documentary called Hope. And we'll put the link below in the show notes so everybody can watch that. But the question I have for you, Sarinda, is what do you hope comes out of, George Floyd's death, and for, even just people in our community here in Whistler, which is a pretty, like, one of the most privileged communities on the planet, and is also one of the most homogeneous communities on the planet as well. So what is, the hope that you have, coming out of George Floyd's death and this and Black Lives Matters movement?
Well, from what I've observed in, like, some of my community, is that people are, genuinely awakening to this conversation about, different peoples that have been suppressed and kind of the reality of our culture. Some people, I think it's very authentic. And even though, like, they've posted for a few weeks or whatever, like, I do feel like people are open to it, and that people, I've observed that people are genuinely invested in that. And that's a beautiful thing. I see also as well in my circle and peripherally in my circle, people that are very, caught up in a certain narrative right now of, like, conspiracies that are going on. And not that I'm against a lot of that narrative, but, like, there's a, strong narrative going on that this is all a big distraction. And that, a lot of this is either politically motivated, or, I mean, even people will say that the environmental movement is, is kind of, has a greenwashing agenda to it, and that there's, more corporate interest behind it than we would like to think. And I don't disagree with that, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to do better on the planet. And although there may be some nefarious motivations behind the latest racial drama that's going on, especially in the United States, and that, there's people that have infiltrated movements. People infiltrated the Black Panther movement. So whether people are infiltrating Black Lives Matter right now does not discredit the fact that there's serious injustice going on. There's serious problems with maternal health rates, with maternal death rates in, Indigenous community. There's people in our country, in the United States, who do not have clean drinking water. There's people that are being brutalized by police in our country across from coast to coast. And that's been going on since slavery in our country. So there's problems. And I don't think you can deny that. And whether there's some, political agenda or distraction going on right now, I don't think that we can, until we all heal, we can't really move forward, or at least until we acknowledge trauma. And if you understand trauma and understand that it is intergenerational, and for those people who are like, why don't they just move on with it? That happened so long ago mentality. It's like, it's in people's DNA. Yeah. Like, if you're a woman and you see a rape scene, I don't know any woman who's not triggered by that, because it's literally in your DNA, because you feel that, because women throughout history have been violated. Yeah. And if you're a Black person and you see a Black person being lynched, it's visceral.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, and I've seen, like, a glimpse of how, a white person may look at that and be able to sort of be distanced from it. But literally, like, I feel that to my core,
but
and it's like,
and on the other side, though, if you have grown up, this is where racism is also in our DNA, and it is intergenerational. And I know that from being in Mississippi and seeing some of my tennis mates and, my roommates, like, go off to KKK rallies in Mississippi. And they literally went feeling like it was their call of duty to participate in that KKK rally. And they didn't even think anything of it, despite the fact that, they're friends with me, like a Black Indian person, but they literally, it was like, it was so in their DNA that it was okay to, hate Black people. And so it goes both ways, right? But we need to change that. And it does have to change, because we have to make it become a visceral experience that is not okay. And it's only going to happen through, telling stories, changing the narrative, giving birth to children where their new narrative is that it's not okay to rape and beat women. It's not okay to rape and pillage the planet and all of its resources. It's not okay to hate people because of the color of their skin. All of that, like, that is ultimately what needs to change. And it starts with the stories that we start telling ourselves today.
Yeah, and I mean, one note on the KKK thing is I don't know if you saw, like, there was a gentleman, a Black African American man on the Joe Rogan podcast, and his big story is how many KKK people he's converted.
Yes, and there's a beautiful documentary on that. I'm going to have to find the name of
Isn't
it.
it great? So you just see how
Amazing.
people literally, they have things in their mind that don't make sense, and when you question them, they realize, right? So it's like there's that. But yeah, that idea of kind of just just changing people's way of perceiving and thinking. And the media is unbelievable, like how much, and if people even remotely understood how much they're being, you know, kind of like, there's a documentary, it's a BBC documentary called The Century of the South. And it's basically like post World War II, how the American culture was basically engineered, like just culture in itself. And so I don't know if it was like Freud's nephew or something, I can't remember. Anyways, it's called The Century of the Self. And so even down to the New Age movement and to all of this like self kind of absorption of, whether it's you sitting on your yoga mat or whether it's you, trying to become a billionaire, it's just like all of our narrative has been constructed. And so, for people to slowly, and like, if you just go through Netflix right now, it is shocking the things that are on there, whether it's, show movies about pandemics and contagion and, all of that, to like politics, to philanthropists, to people watch that and they're like, well, those people must be good, or this must be good, or this is what's happening, or this is the way life is, or, even if you want to even go like, how are people educated about sexuality? Like through media, through porn, like how as a woman do you relate to sexuality, or like what it is to have a relationship, or what sex is like, right? Like, are you educated through like a yogic or Eastern philosophy way, where there's like, you're these two energetic beings, or do you watch it from like how you see like this idea of like a prince saving you, and
or all
girls are just
the
there for
Disney
guys'
stories.
pleasure, or like, what is it, right? Like, how do these things shape us? And most people living on the planet right now are shaped through media, right? And pop culture. And pop culture is constructed. That's like the media. There's like 6 people or organizations that own all of the media on the planet. All the magazines, all the newspapers, all the news channels. And so people think that they're getting different sources of information, but even down to like Vice, which some people think is like alternative, that's still owned by the same company. So, people, I think that's one of the beautiful things, with social media and things, is that there is, if you are somebody who's looking for more diversified information, you can find it, as much as all of those channels are being censored right now.
But even on that note, it's interesting because most of our audience, even though our podcast has been listened to, by people in like 87 plus different countries, the majority of the listeners are from the United States. But here I am with a podcast coming out of Canada. And one example, I just want to like really give people an example of what you're talking about, is that I was teaching in New York just before COVID. I was teaching a group of healthcare practitioners all about how to use food as medicine. And we talked about Monsanto, and we talked about genetically modified food, and we talked about pesticides. And I couldn't believe it when like 9 out of 10 of the participants, so 90% of the participants in the United States, they were all American citizens, had never heard of Monsanto in 2020.
Oh,
and I was, and of course I'm like, I shouldn't be surprised, but at the same time, it was like, I was so shocked by that. And I'm like, on the news, you're not like seeing all the case reports, you haven't heard all but it's not
but
portrayed.
it's not, though.
It's not. And so everybody, depending on what region you are, what state you are, what country you are, you're going to be fed different information and, in the media. But not only that, if you go to do a Google search, unless you actually go into the Google of a particular country, you're not going to get a different perspective. When you search Google, you're searching Google in your own country. You're not
And
going to
now they've changed, like they've co-opted the algorithm. So it's like you can search certain people, and then the only thing, their website won't come up. It'll just come up that there are like an article that's written about them that they're a quack.
Yes.
So it's not even like you could be looking for somebody and you'd think that their website would come up as one of the first things. It's not even there. It'll just come up all these articles discrediting them. Right. So
Exactly.
it's like you need to go to independent search engines. And then,
Yeah.
I mean, and that I've listened to somebody who worked in the military, and he did say like one of the biggest, kind of like wars or attacks on people right now is the fact that everything that they're searching and viewing is coming to them. It's being filtered to them, right? And so, we've seen that with the elections and with Cambridge Analytica, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on right now. And so, unless you specifically know the person that you're following, or like even a whole, and people have said that, like things like, there's been Black Lives protests that have been organized that weren't even really Black Lives Matter people organizing them, for instance, and that's happened in the past, right? So like, somebody can start sharing something or posting something and you're following it thinking it's real, and we have no idea anymore, which is again why it comes back to the individual, and it comes back to you kind of grounding your life into something that's real, right? And we, like, at the end of the day, I just feel like it's like you need to be rooted to the land somewhere. You need to be rooted to your food source. You need to know where your food's coming from. You need to know your neighbors. You need to know your community. You need to know people in real life and not virtual. Like, people are living in a virtual reality, and they're even basing their existence off of a virtual model of what's attractive or what's important or what's valued, or
Which is why
whatever it is.
that COVID is, really happened at almost like such the right time. Like we needed it almost more than ever. And this does not, I'm not saying this to, poke the wounds of people who've lost their family members during this whole COVID pandemic, but just to say that, this almost brings this whole entire interview with you full circle, because at the very beginning, you touched on the fact that it was your intuition. It was you sort of centering in your own body to understand what kind of foods were right for you by not listening to what the rest of the world were saying was the right food to eat, like the McDonald's and the processed food and refined food and the gluten food, but to actually figure out what is right for you. And COVID has forced people to stay on their land, or in their apartment or in their homes, and get connected with their families again, to get to know each other. It's slowed us down. It's allowed us to, be able to sometimes even I hope a lot of people think for themselves in a way, because I know a lot of people got overwhelmed by the media, so they just turned it off. And then that forces you to have to start coming up with ideas on your own, and which is exactly what you did, at the beginning of your journey into healing and wellness and health and connection, and then recognizing the interconnectivity of everything. And so it almost, it's something that I'm hoping for a lot of people out there, that's what it's caused them to do, because, we do need to come back to that place, right? Where we start to, question why we know what we know, and to try and understand what truth is right for us. Because there's so many different truths out there.
Right, exactly. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's like there's this idea that we all have to agree and be on the same page. And I don't think it's that either, right? Like, it's not like we all have to love each other and accept each other. Like, we can not like each other or disagree with people, but we can also give each other space. There's space for everybody, right? It's like we can let people live the way they want to live as long as they're not harming other people. And obviously that's a grander issue, and that gets into interpretation. But just, I think I really hope that, I think this is such a beautiful opportunity, and I hope it's not lost. And I think, for some people, it's like they're going to realize, where they are in their lives and what's important to them. And maybe some people will realize that, like, they love being at home with their kids. Maybe they're going to realize that their kids have thrived and that they want to homeschool their kids. Or maybe they'll realize that their kid had so much anxiety because they were so unhappy at school, and or maybe the opposite. Maybe some people's kids thrive on being social, and this whole isolation thing has been really traumatic for them,
Yeah, if
you know,
anything, I
and
hope it validated what people's intuitions were already saying, because we again hear that like, oh, I wish I could homeschool, but I can't because I should send my kid to school, or, or whatever it is. It could be around food, it could be around your marriage, it could be around your career. Like, I really
yeah.
want to be an entrepreneur, but I have a really good job, so I should just keep my job, as opposed to hopefully COVID, allow them to really get in touch with what is true to them
Yeah, and the
ultimately.
pace of life too. It's just
Yeah.
like, I mean, my nervous system was just like dying to slow down and
Yeah.
not race out of the house every morning and get on the highway and then rush, rush, rush and go everywhere and try and do everything and then get up and do it all over again. And it's just like, why do we operate at this pace? Like
Mm-hmm.
who it's kind of like, I love that idea of like whoever owns your time owns you, right? And it's just
Mm-hmm.
like none of us own our time for the most part. Like we all aspire to this life where we kind of can live on our own terms and our own schedule, but even if you have that kind of carved out in your own personal career, like the society, urges you to go at a different pace, because if it's not just you, it's your kids that are into it, or
Totally.
whatever it is, like we're kind of operating. And I I saw this beautiful quote that this woman made. It was just kind of like, we're experiencing so much anxiety because it's like we're operating at a pace that is not remotely close to the pace of nature, or
Yeah.
like the natural rhythms of things. And I mean, you can even go into women's health with that. It's just like we kind of have controlled women's reproductive systems. We've controlled their menstrual cycles. We can plug and go and just like keep going on and doing all the things. And we don't, and I mean, I think that is something that's even happened before this. And you see that there's kind of like this reconnections with people's moon cycles, and
Mm-hmm.
even workplaces that are being more allowing and open to women kind of working with their cycles, and there's more awareness about all these things. So I do think that there's like a beautiful shift that's happening in, collectively and as a culture. And, the fact that we are so interconnected right now is amazing. And I even was listening to this man who he spent several decades living in the jungle with the indigenous tribes, and he's lived through 2 or 3 pandemics, and worked with the plant Artemisia to help cure pandemics in those areas. But just at the beginning of COVID, in the Brazilian government, they wanted to go into this untouched tribe, and which is like the worst thing, right, for missionary groups to go in and bring
Yeah.
disease, especially at the beginning of a pandemic. And so there was very little media coverage of this, and there was a legal battle to prevent this particular group from going in. And the only reason that they won was because the judge who was presiding went onto social media and saw that there was all these people in support of this tribe and this not happening. And so the judge decided to he started seeing all of this conversation, which was happening in the fringes, not on media.
Yeah.
And he saw that this was happening, and so he educated himself, and then he decided to block these people having access to this tribe. So there is a beautiful thing happening in our connectivity, and it's not like there's all these evil dark forces everywhere. There
No.
are
Yeah.
definitely, they exist, but a lot of it's just based on ignorance and lack of knowing, right? And so
Exactly.
I just think that there's kind of an awakening and an intelligence that's happening that's beyond us. And if you even think of the proliferations of mushrooms literally on the ground and into people's homes and into their bodies and into their medicine cabinets, or kefir or kombucha, like there's like a living organisms that exist in nature that have woven themselves into our day-to-day culture,
Yeah.
and so I think that will animate itself beyond people's mental cognitive ability to change things right now, and that there's just something that's happening that is beyond all of us,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully. Um, and again, I think it's just like people have to align themselves. It's just like sit down and breathe and connect with what's real around you and tangible, whether it's your relationships or what you're eating or your environment where you live. And
Exactly.
because this is literally embedded in all of our DNA. This is not something that we have to seek out outwardly. We don't have to go to anybody if we haven't noticed that most of the gurus are getting torn off of their pedestals. And so we have to stop searching for people to tell us the answers that are literally inside of us.
Which I think it's funny that you just said that, because my next question, to wrap up the show, because we have shared so much information, like people are going to have to listen to this episode like 10 times over just to really touch on all the different topics, which are all interrelated. You can't speak about one without speaking about the other. We can't speak about race without speaking about COVID, without speaking about, the environment and climate change and, food, nutrition, everything, medicine. It's all connected. It's all one. But I was going to ask you, how do people learn from you? So without seeking out the guru, with trusting their own self, but at the same time, you're an educator, I'm an educator, and, and people do also they need guidance, right? So at the same time,
I mean, since this started, I have been starting to work from home with people kind of just virtually. In the time of COVID. And I love connecting with people. Like, I love inspiring people. I love elevating people with where they're at and, just guiding people. Right. So right now, I mean, I do work one-on-one with people. I do want to kind of evolve that into like some groups or programs, but I'm always open to talking with people and connecting with people. And so
how do people connect with you, Sarinda, so they can?
Instagram is easy, and you can put that link. I'm working on my website right now to revamp things, but it's a touch point for sure.
And are you still teaching cooking courses?
Not currently. I'm always open to doing that. I just haven't really been pursuing it, mostly because of circumstance and just other focuses. But yeah, I love sharing food with people. I love just sharing wellness and just helping people at whatever phase they're at. I've been also working on my doula training. Nice. And so that's another passion place for me, because for me, it was such a transformational process, was giving birth and just motherhood. So I love connecting with people pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, after any stage of that. And I'm also really passionate about like women that are coming into that phase of their life, like youth right now. I feel like there's such a beautiful generation that's coming up right now, and they're so aware. And I do feel like their access to intelligent information around their bodies and health is still kind of on the fringe, really. You have to seek it out. So yeah, I'm really just like passionate about women like owning and reclaiming, which seems like so crazy in this day and age, but it's like, again, I think it comes back to our old trauma and our collective wounding. And again, it's such a huge thing to unpack. And even when you say the word patriarchy, I don't even think people can even understand how that's woven into us.
No, exactly.
Because we're all working on that clock and on that framework. It's just kind of like, even our idea of leadership, it's like, why do we still have this like pinnacle male head at the top of it? It's like, what about a council of elders?
Exactly.
I'm super passionate about this whole idea of just like regenerative agriculture, regenerative cultures, regenerative healing, regenerative like correction, like justice systems and healing, right? It's just like, even when we other people, like, it's just like that person committed a crime, like they're bad. It's like, when you look at restorative justice, you go into, why did they commit that crime? What were the situation? What was the ground, the terrain for that to happen? And so hopefully, I think as a culture, we can start digging into all these things of like, why is any of this happening, right? It's like, even people mention Black on Black crime. It's like, well, why is there Black on Black crime? Why are people alcoholics? Why are they shooting themselves? It's not just that they're bad people. Yeah. And it's so reductive to leave it at that, right? And so, yeah, I'm really, I love the idea of just like midwifing people or doulaing people into new ways of thinking and new ways of being, and just to find themselves, really, right? Just to like find the truth of who we all are, which is all innate in all of us. And it's not something that you need a book for, or, I mean, obviously these are all tools and guides and super inspiring, but like for people to realize that it's like everything they have within them.
Yeah. And I love that you said that they don't need a book for it, because I really battled that when I put my book out. I have to take full ownership for that. When I put my book out, because I was like, the world doesn't need one more book. But then
Yeah, but
now
it's a way of
it's a way of knowing and
connecting.
learning. And
Yes.
the one where I've come around from that, because I was also going to say, just like hearing you speak, I was like, oh, Sarinda, you need to write a book, was of course the first thing that came to mind. But one thing that I've really switched my mindset on that is that storytelling, and I talk about this in every podcast, the reason we have this podcast is to share stories, and it's stories inspire, stories heal, stories ignite curiosity. They, guide people in a new direction. They clarify. There's so many things, but also by telling the story itself is also a healing process. And understanding more about Indigenous story work, I mean, oral history and is a traditional foundation in Indigenous communities across for not just Indigenous, non-Indigenous, human, for the entire human race. We have always told stories. So when coming to accept that more, I have also come to accept that that's what a book is. A book is just a story. And so that's why it's okay to create them, even though thousands of books have been already made and are on the planet. So
Of course.
they're really important. And so that's why I wanted to end with, Sarinda, you need to write a book, and you need to teach more, and, and be available so that people can sit, with you in circle, or, maybe it's online, or however it's going to be, whatever that looks like. And so that, what you've come to know can also be passed on to, like you say, those inspiring, incredible younger female generations as well, not just female, male, but all genders really. And so that can be passed down. So it does become, what you've come to know also becomes visceral and in the DNA of those of the future generations as well.
Thank you.
So I think this is a good place to wrap up. I mean, we could have gone on for hours and hours, because there's so much more that we could have dove into on a deeper level, or even on a broader level as well. But Sarinda, I want to thank you for being here and sharing your insights with our audience. And know that this covered a lot of heavy topics for people, lots of controversial ideas and topics that people are battling and dealing with right now. But hopefully that when people listen to this, there's going to be little sparks that were ignited within them, and that that this podcast encourages you to get curious, like Sarinda did in her beginning of her healing journey, and that you just follow that thread wherever it may lead you, and just know that this is just part of your learning process as well, to be inspired by the topics that have been brought up in today's show, so that you can discover just even one more little tiny thing about yourself that will contribute to your healing process. So thanks, Sarinda, for being on the show.
Thank you. And yeah, I want people to stay open and kind to themselves, right? Like this is not going to happen overnight for anyone. So I just think people need to just like be open, be kind to themselves, and be patient, and don't feel like you have to come to like conclusions or some kind of answer to any of this right now. I just think it's like, it is a big opening and it's a big opportunity. And so yeah, there's no hurry. Nature doesn't move that quickly, and time doesn't move that quickly either. So it's like there's no urgency in all this, even though it feels like there's such an urgency.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant point, because I know a lot of people right now are feeling the urgency to learn everything about colonization or decolonizing our education systems, our medical systems, our political systems, like all those systems you talked about. And you can't learn it all in one night, because it is hundreds of years of history that we need to understand, and we need to go through the process of taking it in and then being moved by it, waking up to it, being changed by it, and that's not going to happen overnight. So yes, I agree. We have to be patient with ourselves in this journey.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you. Beautiful.
So, how did you enjoy that show? So, just so you know, Sarinda and I actually kept talking for an hour longer. And what I realized is that we should have kept recording. In fact, we did, but I told our editor, Becky, to just cut it off at the 2-hour mark. But we dove into so many other topics. So we are definitely going to have Sarinda back on the show so that we can dive into those topics in more detail. So thank you all for being here. It is so important that you take in these kinds of messages like we just talked about on this podcast, and that we start educating collectively everyone around us. We start getting vulnerable with our ideas, our feelings, our emotions, our being around anti-racism, around Black Lives Matter, around what it means to be Indigenous. And we start having these conversations so that we can alleviate the walls that we have created. These are settler post-colonial walls that have been created that have prevented us from truly living our richest life possible when we don't allow ourselves to connect with all human beings, because race, which is a European colonial settler mentality, the concept of race was created predominantly by the European culture, the race itself. They're the ones who created that. And we have grown up thinking that there are different races when all in all, there's really just one race, and that is the human race on the planet. And when we can actually break down those walls, that's when we can live our richest, most wholesome life possible. And until we do that, we're only just living a fragment of ourselves. So you can be the most balanced person when it comes to sleep and food and relationships to other people like you, but until you can relate to all people around you. So that is people with different abilities, that is people who have special needs, that is to the LGBTQ community, that is to the people of different colors, religions, ethnicities, cultures, places, all of those things. It's so important that we learn to break down those walls so that we can really, really connect to everyone. And when we do that, we actually realize that we are all one. And then we can even take it a step further than that. And we can begin to realize that we're actually connected to the trees and the soil and the earth and the rocks and the concrete. We have a relationship to concrete. We have a relationship to telephone poles and the cow that's in the field next to me, and the insects and the bugs and the microbiome that are in the soil, but that are also within us as well. Now, until those walls come down, it's hard for us to relate to these other, some people will see it as non-sentient, non-feeling, non-being, non-living entities in the world. But the fact of the matter is that we are connected to everything and everyone around us. And it is truly magical when you arrive at that place and you realize that we are all one. And so starting with reading books on anti-racism, reading about the history of how different cultures came to be in different parts of the world, and the trials and tribulations and the traumas and the wars and the devastation and the oppression and repression that happened. And once you start to internalize that and understand what happened in our world, then that's when we start to develop things like empathy, sympathy, and then from that we can start to develop a whole entire new relationship with the people around us, and then extend that on to the things around us as well. So I know it's a lot to take in. I know that this was a long podcast. I hope that you listened to it in chunks. If you weren't able to listen to the whole thing in one go, there's no need to have to listen to something fully entirely, especially with our long form podcasts. And if you got to the very end of this show and you're hearing this now, as you pass on this podcast to your friends and your family and colleagues at work, let them know that they can take it in small doses as well. It can be baby steps to learning this stuff, or to taking in our podcast or other long form podcasts. Or if you want to dive in, then dive in and learn as much as you can so that we can collectively start working together to make this world a better place for all. Thanks for being with us on the Eat Real to Heal show. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.